The loneliest hearts rarely push people away because they hate them. They do it because trusting someone once cost them everything. The first snow of December drifted across the iron gates of Blackthorn Manor, turning the winding driveway into a ribbon of white beneath rows of towering oak trees. The mansion stood above the Hudson Valley like a forgotten castle, its stone walls catching the last blue light before sunset. Every window glowed warm except one. On the third floor, behind heavy velvet curtains, a little girl watched the world without ever opening the glass. 6-year-old Isabella had lived inside the estate for nearly 4 years, yet every nanny hired to care for her had quietly packed their bags before the month ended. Some lasted a week, others barely survived a single afternoon. It wasn't because she screamed or threw tantrums. She simply never spoke, never smiled, never reached for another human hand. She looked through people as though they were shadows passing across a wall. Rumors spread quickly among domestic agencies across New York. The Vampire King's daughter trusted no one. No amount of money was worth stepping inside Blackthorn Manor. Unfortunately for the people telling those stories, there was always someone desperate enough to accept the job. 300 miles away, Charlotte Hayes folded the rejection letter and slipped it back into her worn canvas bag beside 3 unpaid utility bills. She had worked at a daycare until funding cuts eliminated half the staff. Since then, she had picked up temporary babysitting jobs, cleaned houses on weekends, and skipped more dinners than she cared to count. Her savings could barely cover groceries. When her phone buzzed with an unknown number, she almost ignored it. "Miss Hayes?" a calm voice asked. "Would you consider a live-in nanny position?" Charlotte glanced toward the tiny apartment window where sleet tapped against the glass. "Depends," she answered carefully. "How difficult is the child?" There was a pause long enough to feel intentional. "She hasn't trusted anyone in years." Charlotte smiled to herself. "That's different from being a bad kid." Another pause. "Then can you be in Hudson Valley by tomorrow morning?" Less than 24 hours later, a black SUV rolled through the towering gates of Blackthorn Manor. Charlotte expected security cameras. She expected expensive landscaping. She did not expect absolute silence. No birds perched in the ancient trees. No gardeners worked outside. Even the wind seemed quieter, as if the property itself held its breath. The front doors opened before she reached them. A silver-haired butler welcomed her inside with impeccable manners and eyes that seemed strangely observant. "Miss Hayes," he said, "please follow me." Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers overhead. Portraits stretched along endless hallways, each featuring members of the same elegant family across different centuries. Charlotte noticed something peculiar. The clothing changed with every era. She slowed for half a second before the butler gently encouraged her onward. "The family appreciates discretion." Charlotte nodded, deciding not to ask questions she wasn't prepared to hear answered. She was led into an elegant library where a tall man stood beside an enormous fireplace. He wore a charcoal suit tailored with impossible precision. His dark hair contrasted sharply with skin almost untouched by color. His expression remained unreadable as snowflakes drifted beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. Charlotte instinctively straightened her posture. Every room seemed to revolve around his quiet presence. "Mr. Romano," the butler announced before silently leaving the room. The man looked toward Charlotte with pale grey eyes that never seemed hurried. "You've read the contract?" he asked. "Yes, most people leave within days. I'm not most people." A faint silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, measured, as though he were evaluating far more than her resume. "My daughter owes you nothing," he finally said. "Not conversation, not affection, not gratitude. Your responsibility is simple. Keep her safe. Respect her bounded. Children usually have reasons for building walls. For the first time, something almost invisible shifted across the man's face. Not a smile, something quieter, recognition perhaps, or surprise. At that exact moment, high above them on the 3rd floor, a tiny hand slowly pulled back the curtain. Small grey eyes watched the unfamiliar nanny step deeper into the estate. Charlotte never noticed the little figure standing behind the window. She simply followed the butler toward the grand staircase, unaware that before the night was over, one simple gesture would quietly begin changing a child who hadn't trusted another soul for years. Charlotte followed the butler through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, each one illuminated by soft amber wall sconces that cast long reflections across polished marble. Every room carried the quiet elegance of another century. Antique clocks ticked in perfect rhythm. Massive fireplaces glowed without a single crackle loud enough to disturb the silence. Family portraits watched from dark wooden walls, their painted eyes almost lifelike beneath layers of old varnish. She could not shake the feeling that the house was studying her as carefully as she was studying it. The young lady keeps a very structured routine, the butler explained as they climbed another staircase. Breakfast at 8, lessons at 9, reading after lunch, the gardens if she chooses to go outside. She rarely does. Charlotte listened carefully. Does she like stories? The older man hesitated before answering. She used to. That answer lingered in Charlotte's thoughts long after he opened a pair of white oak doors leading into the nursery wing. Unlike the grandeur downstairs, this hallway felt unexpectedly gentle. Watercolor paintings lined the walls. Shelves overflowed with untouched books and carefully arranged toys that looked more like museum pieces than childhood treasures. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing appeared loved either. At the end of the hallway stood a small sitting room overlooking the frozen gardens. A little girl sat beside the window with a sketchbook resting on her knees. She did not look up when Charlotte entered. She simply continued drawing slow circles with a charcoal pencil while snow drifted beyond the glass. "Miss Isabella," the butler said softly, "your new nanny has arrived." No response came. The room remained perfectly still except for the faint scratching of charcoal against paper. After several quiet seconds, the butler inclined his head toward Charlotte and quietly excused himself, leaving the two alone. Charlotte resisted every instinct to introduce herself immediately. Instead, she walked to a nearby bookshelf, selected a picture book, and sat in an armchair several feet away. She did not face the child directly. She simply opened the book and began reading in a calm, steady voice meant for no one in particular. The story described a lonely fox wandering through a snowy forest, searching for a place that finally felt safe. Charlotte never asked Isabella to listen. She never looked over to see whether the child cared. Minute after minute, only her gentle voice and the turning of pages filled the room. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the scratching sound stopped. Charlotte continued reading anyway. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the little girl glance toward the book for less than a second before returning to her drawing. It was the smallest movement imaginable, yet inside a house where everyone measured progress by silence, it felt significant. Unfortunately for Charlotte, someone else had witnessed the moment as well. Less than one floor below, Luca Romano stood inside his private study watching the nursery through discreet security monitors installed years earlier after repeated threats against his family. He observed without sound as Charlotte respected every boundary his daughter placed between them. She did not force conversation. She did not offer rewards. She did not ask for eye contact. She simply stayed. Most caretakers lasted less than an hour before trying to fix what they barely understood. She had chosen patience instead. Luca quietly turned off the monitor before anyone could mistake his interest for Hope. Hope had disappointed him too many times before. Back upstairs, Charlotte eventually closed the book and rose from the chair. "I am going to make some hot chocolate," she said gently while keeping her attention on the bookshelf rather than the child. "If you would like some, I will leave a cup on the table." Again, no answer came. Charlotte smiled softly anyway and walked toward the door. Just as her hand reached the brass handle, she heard something so quiet she almost believed she imagined it. A tiny footstep crossed the wooden floor behind her. She slowly turned without speaking. Isabella had not moved closer. She had only set her charcoal pencil down for the first time that afternoon. On the page rested a simple drawing of two small hands reaching toward each other without touching. Charlotte said nothing. She simply gave the child a gentle nod before leaving the room. She never noticed the little fingers quietly resting on the edge of the drawing after the door closed. Nor could she know that somewhere deep inside a child who had forgotten what trust felt like, the first invisible crack had just appeared. The following morning arrived beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. Snow rested quietly across the gardens, softening every path and stone statue surrounding the estate. Charlotte woke before sunrise, unpacked the last of her modest belongings into the small guest room, and walked downstairs hoping to learn the rhythm of the house before anyone else stirred. Instead, she discovered that Blackthorn Manor already moved with silent precision. Fresh flowers had appeared in crystal vases overnight. A fire burned steadily in the dining room. Breakfast had been prepared with remarkable care, yet almost no voices could be heard. Every servant seemed to communicate with little more than brief glance and respectful nods. It was a household built upon order instead of conversation. Charlotte carried a small tray upstairs herself, 1 cup of warm milk, fresh berries, toast cut into careful squares, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress. When she gently knocked on Isabella's bedroom door, there was no reply. She waited several seconds before easing it open. The room overlooked the frozen lake beyond the estate. Morning sunlight spilled across shelves lined with dolls that appeared untouched for years. Isabella sat exactly where Charlotte had left her the previous afternoon, this time staring through the window instead of drawing. Charlotte quietly placed the tray on a nearby table. "Breakfast will stay warm for a little while," she said gently. "You do not have to eat now." She turned to leave without expecting an answer. Halfway to the door, she noticed something different. The sketchbook remained open on the chair. Yesterday's drawing of two reaching hands had been joined by another image created sometime during the night. Now a narrow bridge stretched between them. Charlotte looked only long enough to appreciate the picture before continuing toward the hallway. She refused to invade the little girl's private world. Behind her, Isabella's eyes briefly followed the departing figure. Downstairs, Luca Romano stood in the conservatory overlooking the winter gardens while speaking quietly with the estate physician. "Has she spoken?" the physician asked. Luca slowly shook his head. "Not yet, then nothing has changed." Luca watched snowdrift across the glass roof above them. "Something has changed," he answered after a long silence. "She drew again." The physician looked surprised. "She stopped doing that months ago." Luca offered no explanation because he did not have one. He only knew that for the first time in years, his daughter's room no longer felt completely frozen. Later that afternoon, Charlotte wandered through the library, searching for books appropriate for a 6-year-old. Most were beautifully illustrated classics. Hidden between two oversized history volumes, she discovered a slim journal filled with pressed flowers and handwritten fairy tales copied decades earlier. There was no name inside, only careful handwriting describing courage, forgiveness, and children who found hope in impossible places. She smiled and carried the journal upstairs. Isabella remained near the window, quietly watching snowflakes settle across the stone balcony. Charlotte sat in the same chair as before and began reading another story aloud. This time she noticed something new. Every time a hopeful character appeared, Isabella's fingers unconsciously tightened around the edge of her sweater. Every time a frightening moment passed, those little fingers relaxed again. The child was listening. She simply trusted silence more than words. Charlotte never acknowledged the discovery. She only turned another page and continued reading. Outside, the afternoon slowly faded into blue twilight. Candles were lit throughout the manor, one by one, until golden reflections danced across polished floors. As Charlotte finally closed the journal, a faint sound reached her ears. It was almost too quiet to recognize. One careful footstep, then another. Isabella crossed the room until only a few feet separated them. She never lifted her eyes. She simply placed a tiny folded piece of paper on the arm of Charlotte's chair before quietly returning to the window. Charlotte waited until the child looked away before unfolding it. Inside was a single drawing, a snow-covered bridge, two small figures standing on opposite sides, and between them one tiny hand extended just a little farther than it had the day before. Charlotte looked toward Isabella but said nothing. Sometimes the gentlest victories were the ones least disturbed by words. Unfortunately for them both, neither of them realized someone else had noticed the quiet changes unfolding inside the nursery. Hidden among the upper hallway shadows, an elderly housekeeper watched the folded drawing disappear into Charlotte's hands, and the worried expression crossing her face suggested she feared those fragile signs of trust far more than the silence that had filled the manor for years. The folded drawing remained inside Charlotte's sweater pocket throughout the evening, not because she believed it was valuable to anyone else, but because she sensed it represented something fragile that should never be treated carelessly. The manor settled into its nightly silence as snow continued falling beyond the tall windows. Somewhere deep inside the house, an old grandfather clock marked each passing hour, its steady chime echoing through empty hallways like the heartbeat of the estate itself. Charlotte spent the evening organizing Isabella's books, repairing a loose ribbon on one of the forgotten dolls, and placing fresh-colored pencils beside the little girl's sketchbook without mentioning them. She never arranged anything to attract attention. She simply tried to make the room feel a little warmer than it had the day before. The following afternoon brought the first clear sky since her arrival. Pale winter sunlight shimmered across the frozen gardens, transforming every branch into silver lace. Charlotte noticed Isabella lingering by the balcony doors longer than usual. "It is warmer today," she said gently while buttoning her own coat. "I am going to walk in the garden for a few minutes. You are welcome to come if you would like. If not, I will still be here when you decide." Without waiting for an answer, she stepped outside alone. The cold air carried the scent of pine and fresh snow. Footprints formed behind her as she wandered slowly through the winding stone paths. stopping occasionally to admire frost resting on rose bushes asleep beneath winter blankets. She never looked back toward the house. Nearly 5 minutes passed before she heard the quiet click of the balcony door opening. Another minute later came the faint crunch of tiny boots pressing into fresh snow. Charlotte continued walking as though she had noticed nothing. Isabella remained several yards behind, carefully placing each step inside Charlotte's footprints instead of making her own. The distance between them never changed, yet neither turned away. From an upper terrace, Luca watched the unusual procession in complete silence. The child who had refused to leave her room for weeks had crossed the garden without being asked, without promises, without persuasion. She had simply followed. The old housekeeper standing nearby lowered her voice. "This is dangerous." Luca did not remove his eyes from the snowy path below. Why? Because she is beginning to need someone again. The answer lingered between them longer than the winter wind. Down in the garden, Charlotte reached the frozen fountain at the center of the courtyard. She brushed a layer of snow from the stone edge before sitting quietly beneath an ancient oak tree. She opened the small journal of fairy tales and began reading softly into the open air. Birds remained absent, the gardens remained still. Yet the silence no longer felt empty. Isabella slowly approached until only a few feet separated them. She never sat beside Charlotte. Instead, she stood listening, her mittened hands tucked into the sleeves of her oversized coat. When the story ended, Charlotte closed the journal without looking directly at her. "That was my favorite one when I was little," she said with a gentle smile. "I always wondered whether brave people were born brave or simply chose kindness when they were afraid." She rose and began walking back toward the house. Halfway across the courtyard, she felt the lightest pressure against the sleeve of her coat. She stopped. A tiny hand, hidden inside a thick wool mitten, rested against her arm for only a heartbeat before retreating again. Isabella immediately lowered her eyes, as though uncertain whether she had made a mistake. Charlotte did not reach back. She did not celebrate. She simply slowed her pace until their steps naturally matched. Together they walked through the snow toward the manor without a single word spoken between them. Less than a mile away, hidden beyond the tree line surrounding the estate, another pair of watchful eyes quietly lowered a pair of binoculars. Whoever stood among the winter pines had not come to admire the snowfall. They had come to see whether the little girl had finally allowed someone close enough to change everything. Morning sunlight poured through the towering windows, covering the marble floors with ribbons of gold that softened the cold elegance of Blackthorn Manor. Charlotte had been in the house less than a week, yet subtle changes had already begun weaving themselves into the quiet routines no one else seemed to notice. A second cup now appeared beside Isabella's breakfast tray each morning because the little girl no longer remained entirely alone while she ate. The library door stayed open instead of closed because Charlotte preferred sunlight to empty silence. Fresh flowers appeared on the nursery windowsill every afternoon, picked from the greenhouse rather than the frozen gardens outside. None of those changes were dramatic. They were simply gentle reminders that belonged even inside the quietest places. Isabella still had not spoken a single word. She still avoided long eye contact. Yet each afternoon she drifted a little closer whenever Charlotte opened another storybook. Sometimes she sat across the room, sometimes she stood beside the fireplace, pretending to study the flames while quietly listening. Charlotte never acknowledged the progress. She understood that trust was not something earned by celebrating every tiny step. It was earned by making each step feel safe enough to take. Later that afternoon, snow clouds returned, covering the estate beneath another soft blanket of white. Charlotte decided the weather called for something simple. She carried flour, sugar, cinnamon, and apples into the bright kitchen and asked one of the cooks whether she could borrow an empty corner of the large wooden table. Within minutes, the room filled with the comforting scent of baked apples and warm spices. Several members of the kitchen staff smiled as they watched her carefully knead dough with sleeves rolled above her wrists. Laughter remained rare inside Blackthorn Manor, but that afternoon quiet conversation returned to the kitchen for the first time in months. Upstairs, Isabella noticed the unfamiliar aroma almost immediately. She wandered into the hallway, paused beside the staircase, and slowly followed the sweet smell downstairs without realizing she had left the safety of the nursery by choice. Charlotte noticed the little girl standing silently near the doorway, but continued peeling apples as though nothing unusual had happened. "I always thought cinnamon smelled like winter," she said while arranging slices inside a baking dish. "My grandmother believed every house deserved at least one dessert that reminded people they were home." Isabella remained perfectly still. Charlotte smiled gently toward the pie instead of toward the child. Would you like to sprinkle the cinnamon? There was no pressure in her voice, only an invitation. Nearly half a minute passed before tiny footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. Isabella accepted the small glass jar with careful hands. She hesitated, then lightly dusted cinnamon across the apples. The room remained completely silent except for the soft tapping of spice falling onto fruit. No one interrupted the moment. Even the cooks quietly looked away, pretending to remain busy so the child would never feel observed. Unfortunately for Charlotte, another pair of eyes had noticed everything. The elderly housekeeper watched from the hallway, her worried expression growing heavier with every passing day. That evening she approached Luca inside the library where he stood reading beside the fireplace. "Sir," she began carefully, "the young miss is beginning to rely on the new nanny." Luca slowly closed the leather-bound book in his hands. "I know. If history repeats itself," she could not finish the sentence. Luca stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "History only repeats itself when everyone refuses to change." The housekeeper lowered her eyes but remained unconvinced. Upstairs, Charlotte removed the finished apple pie from the oven and carried 2 small plates into the nursery. She placed one slice on the table near Isabella without asking her to taste it. Then she quietly sat down with her own dessert and opened another fairy tale. Several pages later, she heard the faint scrape of a fork against porcelain. She continued reading without lifting her eyes from the book. When the story finally ended, Charlotte gently closed the worn journal and glanced toward the table. Isabella's plate was empty. Beside it rested a neatly folded napkin. Charlotte unfolded it slowly. Inside was another charcoal drawing. This time the bridge was complete. 2 small figures stood side by side at its center beneath falling snow, and for the first time since Charlotte had arrived, both of them were smiling. What Charlotte did not know was that hidden behind the drawing, almost invisible beneath careful pencil strokes, was a small symbol that someone else inside Blackthorn Manor would recognize immediately, and its appearance would quietly change everything they believed about the little girl's silence. The little charcoal drawing stayed on Charlotte's bedside table long after the candles had been extinguished. She studied the tiny symbol hidden beneath the bridge for only a moment before deciding it must have been another part of Isabella's imagination. She had no reason to believe otherwise. The next morning began with gentle snowfall drifting past the nursery windows. Charlotte found Isabella already awake, sitting beside the glass with her sketchbook closed for the first time since arriving at the manor. Instead of opening another story immediately, Charlotte placed a small wooden puzzle on the rug and quietly sat on the floor across the room. She assembled one corner without saying a word. Minutes passed. Then another piece slid softly across the hardwood floor. Isabella had pushed it toward her without lifting her eyes. Charlotte accepted it with nothing more than a grateful smile. They continued building the picture together from opposite sides until the final piece remained. Charlotte deliberately left it untouched. After a long pause, Isabella crawled closer than ever before and carefully pressed the last piece into place. The completed puzzle revealed a lighthouse standing against a winter sea, its warm light reaching across dark water. Charlotte looked at the picture instead of the little girl. "Every lighthouse waits," she whispered. "It never chases the ships, it simply keeps shining." Isabella remained beside her several seconds longer than usual before quietly returning to the window. Downstairs, the elderly housekeeper carried the folded drawing into Luca Romano's private study. He examined the small symbol hidden beneath the bridge with a calm expression that revealed almost nothing. Only those who had served him for decades could recognize the slight tightening of his jaw. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Miss Hayes received it yesterday," the housekeeper answered. "She does not seem to realize it is there." Luca traced the faint lines with one fingertip before carefully folding the paper again. "Do not mention this to anyone. Sir, she has not drawn that mark since." The woman stopped herself. Luca slowly looked toward the frost-covered windows. "I remember exactly when she stopped." The conversation ended there. Charlotte knew nothing about it. Her afternoon remained pleasantly ordinary. She and Isabella spent time inside the greenhouse where winter flowers bloomed beneath warm glass ceilings while snow covered the world outside. Charlotte pointed toward bright orchids, tiny white blossoms, and climbing vines, explaining simple facts she remembered from her grandmother's garden. Isabella never answered, but she listened carefully, occasionally touching a flower with surprising gentleness before withdrawing her hand. As they prepared to leave, Charlotte noticed one small white blossom had fallen onto the stone path. She picked it up and tucked it behind her own ear with an exaggerated smile. "Now I look like a walking flower pot." For the first time, Isabella's shoulders moved with the faintest silent laugh. No sound escaped her lips, but the tiny movement was unmistakable. Charlotte pretended not to notice. Some beautiful moments only survived because no one rushed to capture them. Unfortunately for them both, someone else had been watching from beyond the greenhouse windows. Hidden among the snow-covered hedges stood a figure dressed in a dark winter coat, observing the child through the frosted glass before quietly disappearing between the trees. Less than 5 minutes later, estate security reported unusual footprints near the outer garden wall. By the time the guards searched the grounds, fresh snow had already begun covering every trace. That evening, Charlotte returned Isabella to the nursery after dinner. As she reached for the lamp beside the bed, something unexpected happened. Tiny fingers gently wrapped around two of her own. The touch lasted no more than 3 heartbeats before Isabella slowly released her hand and climbed beneath the blankets without speaking. Charlotte simply adjusted the quilt around the little girl's shoulders and wished her good night in the same calm voice she had used every evening. After she quietly closed the bedroom door behind her, she never noticed Isabella reaching beneath her pillow and carefully placing another folded drawing beside the first one, as though she had already begun preparing for something only she seemed to understand. The following morning unfolded beneath a brilliant winter sky that made every snow-covered branch sparkle like crystal beneath the rising sun. Charlotte found Isabella waiting by the nursery window again, but something felt unmistakably different. Instead of holding her sketchbook against her chest, the little girl carried it carefully beneath one arm as though she had already decided it belonged somewhere else. Charlotte smiled without asking questions. She had learned that the quietest choices often revealed the greatest courage. Together they walked downstairs toward the library, where sunlight poured through towering windows and painted long golden patterns across the wooden floor. Charlotte selected another story, but before she could open the book, Isabella gently placed her sketchbook on the reading table and nudged it toward her. It was the first time she had ever willingly shared it. Charlotte waited. Slowly she opened the cover. Inside were dozens of charcoal drawings stretching back months, perhaps years. Winter trees, empty hallways, silent windows, a lonely little figure standing alone in every picture. As the pages turned, something gradually changed. The newest drawings included another person. At first, the second figure appeared far away, then closer, then walking beside the child. Finally, Charlotte reached the last page. It showed the bridge again. Snow falling gently around two people standing together at its center. Above them, hidden among the clouds, the same mysterious symbol appeared larger than before. Charlotte studied it for only a moment before closing the book with great care. She never asked what it meant. "Thank you for trusting me with your stories." Isabella looked at her quietly. Then, after several long seconds, she gave the smallest nod Charlotte had ever seen. Less than 1 floor below, Luca Romano stood inside his private office examining an old leather-bound journal that had not been opened in years. Resting beside it lay the folded drawing the housekeeper had recovered. The symbol matched one carefully preserved inside the ancient journal with remarkable precision. The pages described an old family tradition dating back generations. According to those handwritten records, children of the royal bloodline occasionally expressed emotions through symbols long before they could explain them with words. The mark did not predict danger, it recognized sanctuary. It appeared only when the child believed someone had become completely safe. Luca slowly closed the journal. For years physicians, scholars and specialists had searched for explanations behind Isabella's silence. None of them had thought to search the oldest family records. Unfortunately for everyone inside Blackthorn Manor, someone beyond its walls had been searching those same records for a very different reason. At that exact moment, a black sedan rolled quietly along the country road outside the estate. A well-dressed man studied photographs spread across the passenger seat. Every photograph showed Charlotte walking through the gardens with Isabella. Another showed the little girl stepping inside Charlotte's footprints after the snowfall. The final image captured the brief moment when Isabella's mittened hand had rested against Charlotte's sleeve. The man quietly placed the photographs back into a folder marked with a single handwritten symbol identical to the one hidden inside the child's drawings. He closed the folder without speaking and drove away. Back inside the manor, unaware of any of this, Charlotte suggested spending the afternoon in the music room where an old grand piano overlooked the frozen lake. She gently pressed a single key, allowing one clear note to drift through the quiet room before another followed. She never played a complete melody. She simply created soft spaces between notes, leaving silence room to breathe. Isabella climbed onto the piano bench beside her. Tiny fingers hovered uncertainly above the ivory keys before pressing one gentle note of their own. Then another. The sounds were simple, almost hesitant, but together they formed the beginning of something beautiful. Charlotte turned toward the little girl with warm surprise. Before she could say anything, Isabella slowly reached across the piano and slipped her small hand into Charlotte's once again. This time she did not let go after 3 heartbeats. She held on. And from the hallway outside the music room, Luca witnessed the moment with eyes that revealed, for the first time in many years, something even older than hope quietly returning to life. Winter settled gently over Blackthorn Manor as another week slipped quietly into memory. The grand estate no longer felt quite as silent as it once had. Morning routines unfolded with subtle changes that only those paying close attention could recognize. Isabella no longer waited alone beside the nursery window before breakfast. Instead, she paused outside Charlotte's room each morning, never knocking, simply standing there until the door opened, as though she trusted the day could not properly begin without seeing the familiar smile that always greeted her. Charlotte never mentioned the habit. She simply accepted it as naturally as sunrise. That afternoon, a fresh layer of snow covered the frozen lake beyond the manor. Charlotte bundled Isabella into a warm wool coat, buttoned every clasp with patient care, and suggested feeding the swans that gathered near the shoreline whenever the weather allowed. The little girl looked toward the lake, then quietly reached for Charlotte's hand before they stepped outside together. Their footprints stretched across the white landscape like a single winding path. The estate staff watched discreetly through tall windows, exchanging quiet glances that carried equal parts relief and disbelief. Many of them had served the family for decades. None had ever witnessed Isabella willingly seeking another person's hand. The lake shimmered beneath pale winter sunlight. Charlotte scattered handfuls of grain across the snowy bank, while several graceful swans glided toward them through a narrow opening in the ice. Isabella crouched carefully beside her, studying the birds with complete attention. One curious swan drifted close enough to stretch its neck toward the little girl. Charlotte remained perfectly still, allowing Isabella to decide what happened next. After several long seconds, a tiny mittened hand slowly extended with another handful of grain. The swan accepted it calmly before drifting away again. Isabella looked after the bird, and although no sound escaped her lips, her eyes carried a quiet wonder Charlotte had never seen before. Sometimes trust begins with the smallest step, Charlotte said softly while watching the lake instead of the child. No one rushed that swan. It came because it felt safe. Isabella lowered her gaze to the snow, her fingers tightening gently around Charlotte's glove. Less than 50 yards away, Luca observed them from the stone terrace outside the manor. He remained hidden behind the columns, unwilling to interrupt a moment that felt far too delicate. The old housekeeper approached quietly beside him. "She is smiling now," the woman whispered. Luca's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "She forgot how," he answered. Someone reminded her. The housekeeper hesitated before speaking again. The family records were right. Luca nodded slowly. The sanctuary mark has never been wrong. Charlotte still knew nothing about the symbol hidden inside the drawings. To her, the afternoon remained beautifully ordinary. She laughed when one adventurous swan splashed icy water onto her boots. She pretended dramatic surprise, making an exaggerated face that caused Isabella's shoulders to shake with another silent laugh. The soundless joy somehow felt louder than words. As dusk approached, they returned to the manor, carrying nothing more than an empty grain basket and rosy cheeks from the cold. While Charlotte hung their coats beside the nursery door, Isabella quietly disappeared into her bedroom for several minutes before returning with her sketchbook once again. She carefully tore out one page and folded it into a neat square. Without hesitation, she placed it directly into Charlotte's hands. This time there was no uncertainty, no hesitation. It was clearly meant to be given. Charlotte unfolded the paper slowly. The drawing showed the frozen lake beneath a bright winter sky. Two figures stood beside the swans, holding hands. Above them, the mysterious symbol no longer floated among the clouds alone. It had become part of a simple pendant hanging around the taller figure's neck. Charlotte smiled warmly, believing it to be another piece of the child's growing imagination. She gently tucked the drawing into her pocket beside the others. At that exact moment, deep inside the restricted archives beneath Blackthorn Manor, Luca opened an ancient wooden chest that had remained sealed for many years. Resting inside was a silver pendant engraved with the very same symbol Isabella had drawn for the third time. As he lifted it into the candlelight, the realization he had quietly feared and secretly hoped for finally became impossible to ignore. The discovery inside the hidden archives remained known to only one person. Luca carefully closed the ancient wooden chest and returned the silver pendant to its velvet lining before locking the room behind him. The symbol engraved upon the pendant had not appeared in the family for generations. According to the oldest records, it was never chosen. It revealed itself only through the eyes of a child who had finally found someone worthy of complete trust. The realization should have brought him peace. Instead, it filled him with quiet responsibility. If the old writings were true, protecting Charlotte had become just as important as protecting his daughter. Upstairs, life continued without the slightest awareness of the history quietly unfolding beneath the manor. Charlotte spent the morning helping Isabella arrange colored paper into delicate snowflakes that soon decorated the nursery windows. Sunlight poured through the handmade patterns, scattering tiny stars of light across the walls. Every few minutes Isabella glanced toward Charlotte, no longer to make certain she remained in the room, but simply because it had become natural to share the same space. The silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like distance, it felt like comfort. Later that afternoon, Charlotte carried a basket of blankets into the sunroom overlooking the frozen gardens. She built a small reading corner beside the fireplace with oversized cushions and invited Isabella to help. Together they draped soft blankets across 2 wooden chairs, creating a simple blanket fort large enough for both of them. Charlotte laughed softly at their crooked construction. "I think architects everywhere would be very disappointed in us," she said with playful seriousness. Isabella looked at the uneven blanket roof, then at Charlotte's exaggerated expression. For a brief moment, the corners of her mouth lifted into the clearest smile Charlotte had seen yet. It appeared quietly, almost shyly, but it transformed the entire room more completely than the fire glowing beside them. Charlotte pretended not to notice. Instead, she crawled inside their little fort and opened another storybook beneath the warm light of a battery lantern. The small shelter turned the grand manor into something wonderfully ordinary. Outside stood a mansion filled with history and secrets. Inside the blankets sat a woman and a child listening to stories while snow drifted beyond the windows. Sometimes healing arrived disguised as the simplest afternoon imaginable. Less than a mile away, however, another conversation was taking place. The man who had spent days observing the estate quietly parked beside an old country church overlooking the valley. He removed the photographs from his folder once more, studying the newest image of Charlotte and Isabella walking hand in hand beside the lake. An older woman joined him on the bench outside the chapel. She glanced briefly at the photographs before looking toward the distant hills. "So the child has chosen," she said softly. The man nodded once, earlier than expected. Then the old stories were true after all. He carefully returned the photographs to the folder. "We are not here to interfere. We only needed to know whether the sanctuary had finally appeared." They left moments later, disappearing without ever approaching the manor itself. Back at Blackthorn Manor, evening settled gently across the estate. Charlotte tucked another log into the fireplace before helping Isabella organize the growing collection of drawings. As she stacked the pages neatly together, one folded sheet slipped onto the floor. Charlotte picked it up, intending only to place it back inside the sketchbook. The paper accidentally unfolded in her hands. It was different from every drawing before it. Instead of bridges or snowy landscapes, it showed a tall man standing several steps behind a little girl while watching her from a respectful distance. Beside them stood another figure with long hair holding the child's hand. Above all three floated the familiar symbol. Charlotte smiled softly. "Your father loves you very much," she whispered without expecting any reply. Isabella looked from the drawing to Charlotte, then slowly toward the closed bedroom door, as though considering something important. At that exact moment, footsteps approached from the hallway outside. The door opened quietly, and Luca appeared carrying a small velvet box in one hand. His calm expression remained unchanged, but the decision reflected in his pale grey eyes suggested that after years of guarding an old family tradition in silence, he was finally ready to reveal the first piece of its truth. The velvet box rested quietly in Luca's hands as warm firelight danced across the nursery walls. Charlotte looked from the box to Isabella and then back again, uncertain why such an ordinary object suddenly made the room feel so still. Luca stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone carrying far more than polished silver. He opened the lid slowly. Nestled inside dark blue velvet lay a delicate pendant attached to a fine silver chain. Its design was simple, elegant, and unmistakable. It carried the very same symbol Isabella had hidden inside every recent drawing. Charlotte recognized it immediately. "She has been drawing this for days," she said softly. Luca nodded. "Long before you arrived, she had not drawn anything at all." He lifted the pendant carefully into the light. "This symbol belongs to my family. It has existed longer than anyone living inside this house." Charlotte studied the graceful curves engraved into the silver. "What does it mean?" Luca remained silent for a moment before answering. "It has never represented power. It has never represented authority. It represents sanctuary." Charlotte looked toward Isabella, who quietly watched the conversation while sitting beside the window. "According to our oldest family records," Luca continued, "children in my bloodline sometimes reveal this mark before they have the words to explain what they feel. It appears only when they believe someone has become completely safe." Charlotte instinctively lowered her eyes toward the pendant again. "You mean," Luca finished the thought gently, "my daughter believes you are the first person she has trusted without fear in many years." The words settled into the room with surprising gentleness. Charlotte never imagined that simple bedtime stories, shared walks through the snow, homemade pie, and patient silence could carry such meaning. She shook her head almost apologetically. "I only treated her like a child who deserved time." Luca offered the faintest smile. "That is precisely what everyone else forgot to do." Isabella slowly climbed down from her chair and crossed the room. She stopped beside Charlotte, looking first at the pendant and then at the drawing still resting on the table. Without hesitation, she placed one small hand over Charlotte's fingers. It was no longer a timid gesture, it was a quiet certainty. Charlotte smiled warmly and gently squeezed back, careful never to hold too tightly. The little girl responded with another unmistakable smile, brighter than any before. Less than a month earlier, that same room had been filled with silence so heavy even experienced caregivers had found it unbearable. Now warmth seemed to linger naturally within its walls. Over the following days, the changes became impossible for the household to ignore. Isabella began joining Charlotte in the library each afternoon without invitation. She spent longer hours in the gardens despite the cold. She listened to music, helped prepare simple meals in the kitchen, and occasionally tugged softly at Charlotte's sleeve whenever she wished to share another drawing. She still spoke no words, but no one questioned whether she was communicating anymore. She had simply chosen another language until her heart felt ready for the first one. The servants smiled more often. The fireplaces seemed warmer. Even the endless hallways felt less imposing beneath the afternoon sunlight. Unfortunately for Charlotte, she still knew nothing about the visitors who had quietly observed the estate from afar. One crisp morning, Luca invited her into the conservatory overlooking the frozen gardens. Steam rose from two untouched cups of tea resting between them. "There is something else you deserve to know," he said calmly. Charlotte looked toward him with quiet curiosity. "The people who were watching the estate are not enemies." She blinked in surprise. "You knew from the beginning." He folded his hands together. "They belong to families who have protected ours for generations. They were never watching you because they feared you. They were watching because they hoped the old tradition might finally return." Charlotte exhaled slowly, relief replacing uncertainty. "So it is over?" Luca glanced through the glass toward Isabella, building a tiny snowman outside with two gardeners. "The waiting is over," he answered. "The responsibility begins now." Charlotte followed his gaze and watched the little girl wave happily toward the window before returning to her snowy masterpiece. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Manor, Charlotte realized she was no longer simply caring for a lonely child. She had quietly become part of the place that child finally called home. Winter slowly gave way to the first quiet hints of spring. Snowbanks along the garden paths melted into clear streams that carried reflections of blue skies across the estate. Blackthorn Manor seemed to breathe differently now. Curtains remained open longer each morning. Fresh flowers replaced evergreen branches inside the hallways. Laughter, once almost unimaginable within those stone walls, appeared in small, unexpected moments. Charlotte noticed it first among the staff. Servants who had once spoken only when necessary now paused to exchange stories over morning coffee. The gardeners proudly showed Isabella the first crocuses pushing through the thawing earth. Even the old housekeeper, whose face had carried years of quiet concern, found herself smiling whenever the little girl wandered through the corridors with a sketchbook tucked beneath one arm and Charlotte walking beside her. The greatest change, however, came not through words but through ordinary routines. Isabella no longer waited to be invited downstairs. Each morning she walked directly to the breakfast room, found Charlotte, and slipped naturally into the chair beside her. During afternoons she reached for books before Charlotte suggested reading. During evening walks she no longer hesitated before placing her small hand inside Charlotte's. What had once required patience had quietly become habit. Luca observed those moments from a respectful distance, never interrupting them unless necessary. He understood something that years of responsibility had taught him. Some gifts became smaller the moment people tried to claim credit for them. One bright Saturday afternoon, Charlotte suggested planting a small flower bed beside the greenhouse. The ground had finally softened enough for spring bulbs. Together they knelt in the fresh earth, carefully placing tulip and daffodil bulbs beneath the soil. Charlotte explained that flowers often spent weeks growing where no one could see them before finally reaching the sunlight. Isabella listened carefully, brushing loose dirt from her gloves after each bulb disappeared beneath the ground. Charlotte smiled. The strongest roots always grow in quiet places. Isabella looked toward the small garden they had planted together. Then she gently touched the earth with one fingertip as though promising to return. From the conservatory window, Luca watched them with calm satisfaction, stepped beside him carrying a silver tray with afternoon tea. "She has changed the child," the woman whispered. Luca slowly shook his head. "No," he answered gently. "She gave my daughter permission to become herself again." The words lingered quietly between them. That evening the household gathered for a simple dinner celebrating the arrival of spring. It was not a grand event. No formal speeches filled the dining room. Long candles flickered across the polished table while musicians softly played string melodies from the balcony above. Charlotte felt almost embarrassed by the warmth surrounding her. She had accepted the position believing she would simply help care for one lonely little girl. Somehow she had become part of an entire family finding its way back toward one another. Dessert arrived just as twilight painted the windows deep shades of lavender and gold. Charlotte excused herself briefly to retrieve the apple pie recipe she had promised one of the cooks. When she returned several minutes later, she found Isabella standing quietly beside her empty chair. The little girl held something carefully behind her back. Every conversation in the room gradually faded without anyone asking for silence. Isabella stepped forward until she stood directly in front of Charlotte. Slowly she revealed a final drawing. It showed Blackthorn Manor surrounded by blooming spring flowers instead of snow. 3 figures stood together beneath a bright morning sky. The sanctuary symbol rested above them like the rising sun. Charlotte accepted the drawing with both hands, her eyes filling with quiet gratitude. Before she could thank the child, Isabella looked directly into her face. The room remained perfectly still. Luca did not move. The servants hardly breathed. After years of silence, the little girl took one careful breath and spoke in a voice so soft it almost blended with the music. "Thank you, Charlotte." 2 simple words floated through the dining room, gentle enough to disappear if anyone had tried to hold on to them, yet powerful enough to heal years of waiting in a single moment. Charlotte knelt without hesitation and embraced Isabella with the same patience that had always defined her care, never too tightly, never asking for more than the child freely offered. Around them, no one applauded, no one interrupted the quiet miracle unfolding before their eyes. Some moments deserved only grateful silence, and inside Blackthorn Manor, silence had finally become something beautiful. Weeks passed with the quiet certainty of seasons keeping their promises. Spring settled fully across Blackthorn Manor, covering the gardens with tulips, climbing roses, and rows of lavender that swayed gently beneath warm afternoon breezes. The flower bed Charlotte and Isabella had planted together began pushing bright green shoots through the soil exactly where they had knelt months before. Every morning the little girl hurried outside after breakfast to check whether another blossom had opened overnight. Charlotte always followed a few steps behind, carrying a small watering can that Isabella insisted on filling herself. Neither of them realized the garden had quietly become a reflection of everything they had built together. It had started beneath cold ground where nothing appeared alive, yet patience had transformed it into something beautiful. The entire household seemed lighter now. The cooks experimented with fresh recipes from the greenhouse. The gardeners proudly invited Isabella to release butterflies that had emerged inside the conservatory. The musicians played cheerful melodies during dinner instead of solemn classical arrangements. Even visitors who occasionally arrived for quiet family meetings remarked that the manor no longer felt like a lonely fortress hidden above the valley. It felt like a home. Charlotte never accepted praise comfortably whenever someone thanked her for the changes. She always answered the same way. Children grow when they feel safe enough to bloom. Luca heard those words more than once, and each time they reminded him that true strength rarely announced itself. It simply changed lives without asking to be noticed. One peaceful afternoon, he invited Charlotte to walk through the oldest section of the estate where towering oak trees shaded a stone path leading toward a small memorial garden. Unlike the formal landscaping surrounding the mansion, this place felt deeply personal. Wind chimes moved gently among flowering dogwoods while birds nested safely in branches overhead. At the center stood a simple stone bench facing a quiet reflecting pool. Luca stopped there and looked across the water before speaking. "For many years I believed I could solve every problem by protecting my daughter from the world," he said calmly. "I built walls, hired experts, and searched for answers everywhere except the one place that mattered." Charlotte remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. She did not need a perfect guardian, he said. She needed someone willing to sit beside her until she found her own courage. Charlotte smiled softly. She carried that courage all along. She only needed someone who believed it was still there. Luca nodded with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for believing before anyone else did." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years spent hoping for a different future. When they returned toward the manor, Isabella came running across the lawn with unusual excitement shining across her face. She carried a tiny bouquet gathered from the first flowers blooming in the garden they had planted together. Without hesitation, she handed the bouquet to Charlotte before wrapping both arms around her waist. It was the first embrace the child had ever initiated completely on her own. Charlotte gently rested one hand across the little girl's back, careful as always to let Isabella decide how long the hug would last. This time it lingered. Sunlight filtered through the flowering trees while warm spring air carried the scent of fresh earth and blossoms across the estate. Several members of the household paused quietly on the front steps, smiling as they watched the simple moment unfold. No one interrupted it, no one needed to. The greatest victories rarely arrived with applause. They revealed themselves in ordinary gestures that once seemed impossible. Later that evening, Charlotte placed the fresh bouquet inside a small glass vase on the nursery windowsill. Beside it, she arranged every drawing Isabella had ever given her, from the first bridge reaching across empty space to the newest picture filled with flowers, sunlight, and smiling faces. Looking across them together, she finally understood that each drawing had never been about imaginary places. They had been a map leading one lonely child back toward trust, one quiet day at a time. Outside the open window, the gentle breeze carried the sound of laughter rising from the gardens below, and for the first time in many years, Blackthorn Manor answered that laughter with a peace that felt lasting. Summer arrived quietly, painting Blackthorn Manor in deep shades of green while sunlight lingered across the gardens long after dinner. The flower bed that Charlotte and Isabella had planted together months earlier now overflowed with brilliant blossoms, each one standing as a gentle reminder that the most beautiful things often spent their earliest days hidden beneath cold ground. Life inside the estate had settled into a peaceful rhythm no one had dared imagine before Charlotte crossed the front gates. Mornings began with breakfast shared beside open windows. Afternoons belonged to books beneath the old oak trees, walks through the gardens, and simple conversations that no longer felt extraordinary because they had become wonderfully ordinary. Isabella spoke more often now, never loudly and never for attention, but with the quiet confidence of a child who no longer feared that her voice would disappear into empty silence. Sometimes she asked Charlotte to read another chapter before bedtime. Sometimes she pointed excitedly toward butterflies dancing above the lavender fields. Sometimes she simply whispered, "Look," whenever she discovered another flower blooming where they had planted one together. Every word felt like another window opening inside a home that had once forgotten sunlight. One warm evening, the household gathered on the western lawn to celebrate the first full bloom of the memorial garden. Long wooden tables were decorated with wildflowers collected from the estate. Soft lanterns swayed beneath ancient oak branches, while musicians played gentle melodies that drifted across the valley. The celebration was modest, exactly as Luca preferred. He believed gratitude was strongest when it did not compete with grandeur. As twilight settled over the gardens, he rose from his chair and quietly lifted a crystal glass. Every conversation faded. "There was a time," he began calmly, When I believed protecting my family meant building higher walls, I was wrong. His eyes rested briefly on Isabella before turning towards Charlotte. Homes are not healed by stronger walls. They are healed by people brave enough to walk through the front door carrying kindness instead of fear. The words settled gently over everyone gathered there. Charlotte lowered her eyes with quiet humility, never comfortable standing at the center of anyone's praise. Isabella slipped her small hand into Charlotte's once again, smiling with complete certainty. No hesitation remained, no invisible distance separated them anymore. After dinner, the little girl quietly disappeared into the house for several minutes before returning with a familiar sketchbook tucked beneath her arm. She walked to the center of the garden where everyone could see her and carefully removed one final drawing. Instead of handing it only to Charlotte, she turned it outward so the entire household could see. It showed the great stone manor beneath a bright summer sky. The windows glowed warmly, flowers surrounded every path. 3 figures stood together in front of the entrance holding hands. Above them, the sanctuary symbol no longer floated in the clouds. It had become part of the sunlight itself, shining gently over the home below. Across the bottom of the page, written carefully in a child's neat handwriting, appeared 6 simple words. Home is where hearts feel safe. Charlotte felt tears gathering despite her smile. She knelt beside Isabella and embraced her gently while the little girl rested her head against Charlotte's shoulder without the slightest trace of fear. Nearby, Luca watched the moment with quiet peace reflected across his face. He no longer saw a lonely daughter waiting behind closed curtains or a desperate young woman searching for work. He saw a family restored not through miracles or impossible power, but through patience, compassion, and the courage to remain present when leaving would have been easier. As the evening faded into a sky filled with quiet stars, lantern light shimmered across the reflecting pool where months earlier Luca had admitted that walls could never replace love. Gentle laughter floated through the gardens while warm summer air carried the scent of blooming roses across the estate. High above them, the 3rd-floor nursery window remained open to the night, no longer hiding a lonely child watching the world from behind heavy curtains. Instead, it welcomed fresh air, soft music, and the promise of another peaceful morning. And if anyone had returned to the manor after all those seasons, they would have found the opening image transformed forever. The little girl who once stood alone behind cold glass now stood barefoot among flowers, one hand resting confidently in Charlotte's, the other reaching toward her father as sunlight filled the place where silence had once lived, proving that the strongest sanctuary was never built from stone, but from the quiet courage of a heart willing to trust again.